Through the Bible in 60 Minutes with David Cooke. Part 1. Foundations and Covenants, Genesis and the Law.
The Bible is the most popular book in the world, and yet many people have never read it, even those who call themselves Christians. The word Bible actually comes from a Greek word, biblia, which means library or books, and it's actually made up of 66 books written over a period of 1,500 years. Christians believe it's God's message to us, which is why it's such an important book. And I want to tell you the story of the Bible to encourage you to read it for yourself. The first book in the Bible is called Genesis. Genesis means beginnings. And right at the beginning of Genesis, it says, "In the beginning, God." The Bible doesn't argue for the existence of God. It assumes he's there from beginning to end. God is there. And at the beginning of the Bible, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." God created everything in the universe that we know, the sun, the moon, the stars, and on the earth, the sea, the land, the air, and the animals that live in the sea and in the air and on the land. And the pinnacle of God's creation was man and woman, people. Adam and Eve he created and put them into a garden. It was a perfect world. God said, "It is good, it is good, it is good." And at the end he said, "It's very good." Everything in the garden was lovely. God is introduced as our creator, but also someone who wants a personal relationship with us. It said he walked in the garden with Adam and Eve. But if we look around the world today, it doesn't all look good, does it? It's not all good. So what went wrong? In chapter 3 of Genesis, we're introduced to the Satan, or the devil. Adam and Eve have just been given one rule by God. Do not eat of a certain tree. A certain fruit tree you're not to eat of. Just a small thing, but the devil came and twisted God's words and said, did God really say that? Did he really mean that? And first Eve and then Adam take the fruit, they eat it. And immediately they are filled with guilt and shame. They cannot face God in the way they did before. Their relationship with him is broken. When God talks to them about it, they find excuses and they blame one another. The man blames the woman, and God, for giving the woman in the first place, the woman blames the serpent. God punishes all three. And at that point, the whole world, the whole universe is changed. It becomes completely different because of what man and women did at that point. God throws man and women out into a hostile and painful world, and the ultimate punishment is death. Death for animals, death for the man and woman. Is that the end? Does God give up at that point? No. The rest of the Bible is all about God reaching out, trying to rebuild that relationship with man and woman that he had in that perfect world at the beginning. But what we see is that this sin, that's a Bible word meaning falling short of God's standards, this sin multiplies rapidly, and we find that one of Adam and Eve's sons kills another one. Murder comes into the world really early on. And very quickly the world is full of evil and wickedness, and God says, I'm just going to start again. And he wipes the world out with a flood. And we're very familiar with the story of Noah and his sons and all the animals that go into the ark, and how God brings them out once he's purged the world of sin, and they start again. But very quickly we see generation after generation going back into this evil and wickedness that was there before. What is the solution to the problem of man's sin? Well, in Genesis chapter 12, it focuses down onto one man, a man called Abraham. God chooses him and he makes a covenant with him. Now, a covenant is a legal agreement. It's a commitment between two parties. This signifies a marriage. A marriage is a commitment between two people, a covenant. If you buy a house, then one person covenants to give a load of money, the other person covenants to give the property. And God makes a covenant in Genesis chapter 12, and he said this to Abraham, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, which just means to look favourably on you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. God's favour on Abraham is not just for him, but for him and his descendants to pass on to the whole world. Abraham lived in a town called which was in what we would now call Iraq, and he set out on a journey of 2,000 miles to go to a land that God said he would give to him, a land that we now call Israel. It was a journey into the unknown with God. And he lived there for the rest of his life, confident that God would give him that land, or his descendants that land, even though he personally only ever owned one plot of land, which he bought to bury his wife. The promise to Abraham passed to his son Isaac, and then to his son Jacob. And Jacob was a very complex character. Deceit runs through his life. He deceived his own father, his own brother, his own uncle. The uncle deceives him back. He's a man full of deceit. And yet God doesn't give up on him. God keeps coming after him. And eventually it's like they wrestle together. And God gives him a new name, Israel, which means he wrestles with God. And Israel becomes the father of the nation that bears that name, Israel. And he has 12 sons, and they become the fathers of 12 tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel. And the rest of the Old Testament, that's the first part of the Bible, is about God's dealings with this people, Israel. The most famous of Jacob's 12 sons was Joseph. And Joseph was sold by his brother into slavery. And he was then thrown into prison for something he hadn't done, but then becomes prime minister of Egypt. And God puts him in that position to save Egypt from famine and to enable his people, because he brings his family down to Egypt to live in the best part of the land. So when Genesis closes, the first book of the Bible, when that closes, we see God's people of Israel living in the lap of luxury in Egypt. We've done one book, we've just got 65 more to go. After the book of Genesis, it goes quiet for 400 years. The second book of the Bible, Exodus, gives a very different picture. 70 people went into Egypt originally, and there are now 2 million of them. And the Egyptians have become very frightened by their numbers and have enslaved them. They treat them very harshly, they use them for building projects. And by the time Exodus opens, they've decided also to kill all the baby boys as they're born. The midwives are instructed to throw them into the river. Has God forgotten his promise to Abraham to give them the land? Well, in the first 2 chapters of Exodus, we read about Moses, a man who was saved and from death when he was born, and actually adopted into Pharaoh's palace. And he becomes a prince and goes to effectively the best university in the world to learn the wisdom of the Egyptians. But after 40 years, he has to flee from Egypt, and he goes out into the desert. And there he looks after sheep in the desert for 40 years. And when he's 80, God then meets him and says, right, Moses, you're ready for what I want you to do. God introduces himself with a name. He says, my name is I am, or the Lord, as we write it in our Bibles today. And Moses is sent back to Egypt and goes to the Pharaoh, the king, and says, let my people go. And the Egyptians say, no, we're not going to let them go. And God sends plagues on them until eventually the Egyptians drive them out. And they go out through the the Red Sea, into the desert. After 400 years, the people are free. And God starts shaping them into a nation. Moses leads them to Mount Sinai. And God there makes a covenant with them. And this we used to call the Old Covenant, or in different language or different words, the Old Testament. And in Exodus chapter 19, it says this was the covenant God made with his people. If you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Notice that first word, if. This is a conditional covenant. The people have to keep their side of the bargain. They have to obey God fully and keep his covenant. What is his covenant? Well, God gives them a whole load of laws. And in the next chapter, we read the 10 commandments that God gave them. And the 10 commandments tell the people how to relate to God and how to relate to one another. These laws are then expanded in the rest of Exodus, and Exodus also contains details of a place for the people to worship, a tent or tabernacle it's sometimes called, in the middle of their camp where they went to worship God. And then after Exodus, there's a book called Leviticus. Leviticus is all about sacrifices. For the people to get themselves right with God, they sacrifice animals, a death in substitute for their own death, to put their relationship right with God. And the people spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness, and that is covered in this book, Numbers, which talks about, more laws are there, but talks about their time in the wilderness. And then the 5th book is Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy means repetition of the law. The law is repeated and expanded. These 5 books of the Bible are sometimes referred to as the books of Moses or the law. And the law is the foundation for the rest of the Bible.
If this has encouraged you to learn more about the Bible story, then here are 2 books by David Cooke that will help you get to know the Bible better. Both books can be purchased from Amazon. Thank you for watching.